Welcome to the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Since 2010, the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska has worked toward one goal, a food and water secure world. One in which global food security is ensured without compromising the use of water to meet other essential human and environmental needs. It's a daunting vision, but one that is vitally important. This podcast amplifies the voices of those making waves in this space. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Today I'm excited to be talking with Nebraska State climatologist and Doherty Water for Food Institute Faculty Fellow, Martha Shulski. Martha's also an associate professor of applied climate science in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska, and she's also a self-proclaimed weather nerd. Martha's research interests are in the areas of climate variability and climate impacts. And of great importance is also how these changes impact our society and our environment. A lot of the projects Martha has been involved with are interdisciplinary, bringing together researchers from various specialties to study an issue. And climate is a critical component to almost all environmental issues. Martha also has a strong interest in understanding information needs, and she often works closely with the users of weather and climate information to deliver decision support tools for them. So Martha, to get us started, tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your work.
Yeah, I'm from Nebraska originally, but I didn't grow up here. I was fortunate that my family moved around a lot, so I got to experience a lot of different places and a lot of different types of weather and climate. And I first became interested in the weather when I was about 7 years old, and my family spent part of the night in the basement because there was a severe storm moving through, and it scared me at the time. And that's also what sparked my interest in meteorology. I wanted to understand what was going on and why, and how does the weather impact people. And so I fell in love with weather at the age of 7 and never looked back, I guess. So I went to school in North Carolina. I got a degree, my undergraduate degree in meteorology, and got my master's here at Nebraska back in the 90s in the agronomy program, and looked at how weather influences plants, essentially, and got to do some field research, which was really exciting. It's something I had not done in my undergraduate. And then I got my PhD at the University of Minnesota, and I looked at snow fences and how do you mitigate windblown snow and keep roads clear by capturing it on the landscape and not letting it hit the roads. And so that was a very interesting applied climate project. And I got to work with landowners and University Extension and the state Department of Transportation, and bring a lot of information together and produce something that's still actually in use today. In fact, so it's interesting, I think, that my PhD work is not just a book on a shelf somewhere or exist on the internet. It's an actual tool that road designers use, which is really neat. And my first job I got was at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, and I worked there for 7 years, and it was it's a really unique place. I had not been anywhere like that before. The scale of everything is just huge, and the landscape is beautiful, and the impacts of climate change are real and tangible. And they're right there. It's not something that you have to wonder, where is climate change? It's there. And I got to work with a number of different people, and I got to work with tribal entities and indigenous communities. And that's where I really got an appreciation for when you have even slight changes in climate that can have a really significant influence on people and their livelihood. And that's when I really got an interest in working with end users of climate information and helping determine what people need in terms of climate variability and climate change information, and understanding how climate impacts people and the environment.
Well, you call yourself a weather nerd. Expand upon that a little bit more about why you call yourself that, or what that means to you.
Yeah. So the weather is something that everybody talks about for the most part. And unlike climate, it's not very controversial. And what's the weather today? And so why I call myself as a weather nerd is I really want to understand, why do we experience what we are today? And what does the forecast tell us? And what are these cloud formations, and just anything related to the weather in our environment. It's very dynamic. And so part of my passion is just understanding, how do we explain that using math and physics, and how do we forecast that? And most importantly, how does it impact people? And what I really enjoy is giving people the science behind what we see and what we experience, and why do we get these certain kinds of clouds, and why do we get thunderstorms in the evening here, and all these different questions that people have, but they don't have the science background maybe to explain it. And so that's what I really enjoy, is sharing my knowledge of weather with everybody around me.
Well, what would you say is the most interesting part of your work as a climatologist?
Yeah, good question. I think the most interesting part of my work is interacting with the range of people that I get to talk with and communicate with and work with hand in hand. I actually enjoy working with the non-scientific community, people who are making a decision based on weather or climate information, people who are dependent on what's going on with the climate, or what the outlook will be for the upcoming growing season or the upcoming decade. So to me, the favorite part of my job and why I do what I do is to interact with those people who need, require, and depend on this information. So for me, it's really that aspect of the science that drives what I do. I'm interested in the physical science part of it, but I'm really interested in, how do I give this scientific information to people who are ultimately using it for some sort of purpose. So to me, that's by far my favorite part of my job.
You recently gave a talk at the Water for Food Research Forum where you discussed communicating science, specifically climate change, with various audiences of different viewpoints. Tell us a little bit about how you do that and what you suggest for people there.
So the thing that I think about the most is approaching it with empathy and trying to understand where the other person is coming from. Because half the audiences I talk to are going to question what I say, or maybe don't believe what I say, or come at it with a different perspective than I do. So my goal is to recognize that and to understand where they are coming from. So knowing your audience, I think, is really critical. How do they feel on the information I'm going to be providing them? I always ask, if I get an invitation to speak, I always ask the organizer, how do people feel about this topic and how are they approaching it? Because that ultimately frames how I talk about it. So thinking about the way you introduce the science and the way how you talk about it and the frame you put around your topic, and for me, that's climate and climate change, that can make or break my engagement with a group. And so for me, that's really critical, is the approach and the frame, and knowing who I'm speaking with, and giving them the opportunity to share their opinion. Even if it may be scientifically incorrect, what they want to share, that's fine. Giving them the opportunity to share their perspective is really important, and that can help to change their mindset or change their behavior, or be more open to the information that I'm telling them. If I listen to what they're saying, then they are much more open to also listen to what I am telling them. So especially in dealing with a topic that can be controversial, giving the space and the opportunity and the time, and being empathetic toward people that feel differently than I do, I found it's really important, and it can help open up lines of communication, and ultimately result in something that is meaningful. And you can actually get somewhere, get to where you want to go, and have people be more open to the science of climate change and understand that, yeah, humans are playing a role. So let's work together to figure out what these solutions are to mitigating future climate change, or whatever the specific topic around climate change is. I also bring in local examples to how climate change impacts us personally. Social science tells us that for much of the US, people do not feel that they are impacted directly by climate change. So my role as a state climatologist and communicator on climate change is to illustrate that for people, make that connection between something that is very big and global scale that's really hard to wrap your head around, and provide specific, local, concrete examples of how we feel climate change. So that can serve as a great frame for how I talk about climate change. So in the past, I have used examples like the flood of 2019, or the cold snap that we just had for much of the Great Plains this February, how you can actually tie that to climate change, because people are not going to deny that we had a flood. That's not controversial. So start with something that is not controversial and connect those dots back to this bigger picture of climate change. So those are some strategies that I utilize every time I talk to an audience. A lot of that for me is subconscious. I don't even think about the tools I'm using. I just have done this long enough that I use them throughout my interactions with people.
Well, obviously you talk to a lot of different groups of people with varying attitudes, and as you said, this can be a very controversial issue and also very emotional. So how often would you say you encounter people who are very set in their position on the issue and really don't want to hear anything you have to say about it? Are you finding still people like that?
So I find that it has shifted over time. So I've been state climatologist in Nebraska for about 6 years now. I've worked in climate in Nebraska for about 11 years now. So I found that over those years, the tide is certainly shifting and things are changing, and people are more open and more receptive to talking about climate change, recognizing that, gosh, things are changing. We had this big flood, and then it was a drought this year. These extreme weather events that we experience are a really good tool at helping people to understand to recognize what's going on, to question, how does this relate to climate change? The number one question I received after the flood of 2019, which was historic proportions, very large scale, was, did climate change cause this? That was the question that people were asking. And my answer to that was, that's really the question that you should be asking, is how much worse was it made by climate change? Because climate change is already here and it's already impacting everything that we experience. So the question is really, how much worse was it made? But yeah, so I find that it's a smaller and smaller percentage of people that doubt what I tell them or really strongly feel against the information that I'm providing them. It still does happen in certain settings, and I stick to the science. I'm respectful of their opinions. I hopefully I'm changing some people's minds by showing up year after year, talking to the same audiences, and just keep saying my message in an approachable way. But yes, I do find that the people that fervently disagree are getting less. And there's more people who maybe in the past have disagreed, but now they're feeling these impacts. It's more real to them, and they're wanting to be at the table to figure out solutions. I think that's in the past, maybe that's been part of the problem, is there's been blame put on certain group, like the agriculture industry, people point fingers at them. Oh, you're the problem here. You're the cause of this. And well, that's not really the case. We need to work with everybody, bring everybody to the table to figure out solutions together. Pointing fingers is not going to solve it, but working together towards solutions, that will be helpful and solve things.
Well, how would you say that these lessons could be applied in other situations to talk about climate change in agriculture?
So I typically bring in these extreme events that people do experience and think about profitability or conservation. A lot of people are really interested in conservation efforts and, again, making sure that they're the most profitable, diversifying their practices, thinking about soil health, and kind of look at these other aspects that are maybe climate adjacent, I call them. So it's not directly scream climate change, but it's thinking about soil health and conserving your water, making sure your practices are the most energy efficient and using the fewer resources that you can, putting less water, maybe irrigating more smartly, not more irrigation, but irrigating smarter, or putting nitrogen on fields, or whatever part of that management aspect it is, focusing on that as opposed to kind of the larger climate change question. So I find that is helpful to go around the issue of climate and focus on something other than that will also tackle climate. Health would be another one, either human health or animal health. Economics could be another one. What's going to save you money is also probably going to help save the planet. And just thinking again about how we use our resources in the most efficient way will also tackle climate change. And so I was a part of this project where we worked with cities, 3 in Nebraska, and then others scattered throughout kind of the central US. And part of this project was conducting a survey where we asked the cities, what's the best way to communicate on climate for your area? And the two best ways that the two items that bubbled up from that survey was weather events and economics. And so those are great aspects to focus on from a municipal planning perspective, that also gets people on board with the climate issue as well. So again, thinking maybe less even about climate change and more about these adjacent issues that also help with mitigating future climate change.
What would you say is the biggest challenge in your work related to the impact of climate change on the environment, and how do you attack that challenge?
The biggest challenge that I have is, it takes time to develop a relationship and interact with people, trying to get that percent of the population or those lawmakers that are not interested in solving this issue. The biggest problem thing that I think about the most is how do you get those people on board with this? If the tools that I'm currently using don't work, then what will work? And so I tend to think mostly about the social science aspect of it and engaging. If I'm not reaching a certain part of the population, then what will work with that? And if trying to tackle those barriers in getting action on climate change, because that's really where we are right now with regard to the climate change issue, is we need action and we need it very soon. We can't linger too much longer. So it's getting kind of that final crowd on board, tackling those barriers that are currently preventing action on climate change, and trying to move us all forward with regard to acting on this, because it is not too late but time is running, the clock is ticking and time is running out. So that's, the thing that keeps me up at night, so to speak, is how do you bring that last part of the population, or how do you bring those resistant policymakers on board so that we get the mitigative action in place that we absolutely need?
How would you see the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute as part of the solution of talking about climate change and discussing it in different groups, the different audiences? What role do you see the Institute playing there?
So I think it could serve as a great forum and space to bring those parties together. Those last barriers that I'm talking about, how do we break those down? And so having a comfortable space that can foster dialogue and communication among those parties that need to come together. And again, in my opinion, it's people that are implementing policy or are not implementing policy, bringing them to the table and working through these solutions. So in my opinion, we need to be thinking through and getting people on board with solutions. So providing that space in which we can do that in a constructive way, to me, that's really what's needed. The University of Nebraska is wealthy with a lot of really smart people that are, running models. They're thinking about the science aspect of it. We know that we need to reduce our carbon footprint. We need to reduce emissions by X amount. We know what needs to be done from a scientific perspective, and we need the people on board and the policy in place to make that happen. So in my mind, that's something that this institute could help with and could provide. Climate is one of these issues that it takes all of us in some capacity. So bringing agricultural interests, bringing water managers and water planners. In Nebraska, we're fortunate to have natural resource districts. So we already have jurisdictions in place at the basin scale. Or going beyond Nebraska's borders. And, climate does not stop at any political border. So coordinating with those around us that have similar agricultural interests, that also use irrigation, that also have ranching and cattle and, all the interests that we do. I'm thinking of it from an ecosystem perspective that realizing that there's policy that follows political borders, but the climate and climate change issue does not. And so what we do in Nebraska, that impacts everybody and vice versa. So looking at the tools and the infrastructure that we do have in place in Nebraska, bringing that diverse perspective and including the states and the region around us to look at it as well, because sometimes you are stronger together as a larger group.
Well, that is all the questions I have, Martha. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I'll touch on something that I hit on at the research forum, and that is sometimes recognize that science is not enough. And for somebody who's trained as a scientist like myself, my background is purely in science, applied science, but thinking beyond that and thinking about social science and the human component is really important, because to solve the climate issue, what we need is behavior change. And so that's a really important aspect for people to think about, is there's a human component too. And you also have to be cognizant of that when you're working toward, if you want solutions to be lasting and meaningful, and you want those mitigation plans that you put into place, it doesn't do any good if it sits on a shelf. You need it to actually be implemented and utilized. And for that, you need people and relationships. So those are critically important in my mind, and something that we shouldn't forget about.
Well, thanks very much, Martha. Our guest today, Nebraska State climatologist and DWFI Faculty Fellow, Martha Shulski. Thanks for joining us this time on the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Make sure to visit our website, waterforfood.nebraska.edu. to view show notes or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.